the dynamic tension that psychedelics bring to the fore in the modern world between the sacred and the secular, or between the naturalistic accounts and supernaturalistic accounts, or in a slightly different framework between materialism, not in the sense of like wanting to collect things, but in the sense that we can account for everything essentially in terms of the dynamics of matter moving through time, historical forces, our own motivations we can talk about in terms of the body and the brain. And on the other hand, we could say idealism or even spiritualism, the idea that there is some kind of spirit or incorporeal essence or entity that resists or lurks outside of that materialist framework. So of course this is a very important dynamic in our civilization, in our culture. And I will be speaking mostly from the secular side, in the sense that I'm interested in the way that the sacred challenges, undermines, and also calls forth secular or materialist accounts, and that this dynamic is an incredibly important one, and one that affects us all personally. It has to do with the difficult ways we try to seek spirituality and yet find ourselves unable to plug into traditional frameworks of religion and previous ways that cultures have organized sacred desire and sacred experience, because we're moderns. We're part of this evolving civilization, for better or worse, that has invested a tremendous amount of explanatory power for very good reasons into materialist accounts that are themselves changing and transforming every day. As we learn more about neurology, any claims we're going to make about sacred experience have to change and have to shift. But at the same time, I want to suggest that in a very powerful and very profound way, the sacred continues to beckon beyond the frameworks that we establish from a secular perspective. And this is particularly observable in a number of different domains with psychedelics. And it's one of the things that makes studying psychedelics from a kind of cultural, anthropological, and also psychological, neurological angle extraordinarily interesting and very, very important, and one that I think will actually become even more important in a variety of ways as we in the West begin to wrestle with, in more subtle ways, this fundamental tension between materialism and a more spiritual account of reality. Because of course that there's tremendous forces out there who are interested in a solely rationalist, materialist account of things and see everything else as being a bunch of hooey. And at the same time, of course, we're sitting there and looking at the contemporary manifestation of traditional religious impulses, and they're extraordinarily problematic. So for those of us who are in between, who are drawn towards spirituality, drawn towards sacred experience, and yet uncomfortable with the traditional frameworks that people approach these, psychedelics play a very important and crucial role. But before I talk more about psychedelics, I just wanted to bring up another example, something that doesn't involve psychedelics, that gives you a little sense of how I'm trying to approach these things in terms of cultural history, anthropology, and a relationship to the body, relationship to the sort of object that materialists and secular explanations want to remain in. And that example is yoga in America. This year, Stephanie Simon came out with a great book called The Subtle Body, which is a cultural history of yoga in America. And one of her arguments that I think is very well supported is the way she talks about once people began to practice something like hatha yoga, around the turn of the last century, starting in many ways in New York City. At least her story starts here in many ways, with the omnipotent but I'll leave him aside. And what she charts, again, quite believably, is a kind of sine wave of the development and the experience of yoga in the West from then to now, or slightly over a century time, in terms of how people experienced it and practiced it in terms of its spirituality. There were points when it was very much of a spiritual activity, where what one was generating were these subtle states that could plug one into religious experience, sacred experience, esoteric energy levels, et cetera, et cetera. And then at other points in the history of yoga in America, it was very secularized. It was turned into a kind of exercise, a kind of way of stretching, a way of embodying, a way of managing the difficulties of modern life. It was very lycra-clad and materialistic. And that these two tensions, which anybody who's familiar with the culture of yoga can recognize that both of them are extremely strong in the culture today, when there are both very spiritualistic accounts, very tantric, of energy bodies and spiritual unfoldings, and at the same time we can see very much how it has become part of the exercise industry with its own markets. It's in gyms, and in all of these environments it often becomes very secularized. And so what is it? Is it sacred or not? Is it spiritual or not? And for me, what I'm kind of arguing is that that tension, which we also find in a number of ways in psychedelics, is a wonderful key thing to pay very close attention to. Because what I want to argue is that this flip-flop between sacred and secular, between materialist accounts and spiritualist accounts, between naturalism and supernaturalism, has the character ultimately of a mobius strip. As you're familiar, a mobius strip is, a strip of paper that of course has two sides, like any strip of paper topographically, and yet it's constructed in a way that if you follow one side, you'll find yourself on the other side. And what I want to say is that this is the way that we deal with the sacred now, is to follow this fluctuating line between different domains, and that rather than taking sides in the account, what we actually want to do is to embrace, intensify, and try to figure out a way to experience and navigate and talk about precisely this flip-flop of the mobius strip. So what do I mean by the sacred? Well, when secular people wanted to start producing naturalistic accounts of religion and anthropology and traditional peoples, one of the primary ideas was the idea of the sacred. So people were trying to, anthropologists, the late 19th century, early 20th century, were saying, well, so how do we talk about religions? What constitutes a religion? And the idea of the sacred was very important. Now, of course, the idea of the sacred is also very watery. It's very hard to figure out exactly what the sacred is when you try to describe it more and more. Probably an account that some of you are familiar with and that is very helpful from a psychedelic perspective is Rudolf Otto's idea of the mysterium tremendum, that at the heart of the sacred is not just a set of taboos that set aside something special from the secular, but that it actually involves a kind of experience. There's an experiential dimension to the sacred, and it's not just a happy, fluffy, yay, yay, God's good kind of experience, that it has some terror in it, that it has some awe in it, that it has some sublimity in it. But basically, there's this attempt to try to figure out what is specific about religion, what sets it apart from other things in human experience. And even from a secular point of view, you have to engage with this problem of the sacred. So I want to talk now about the way that this flip-flop between secular and sacred has occurred inside psychedelics, both culturally and in terms of research. So I'm just going to go through a number of different zones and return us in a way to this mobius strip. Well, one of the things that psychedelics provide people in terms of the ideas of religion, the history of religion, the anthropology of religion, is an explanation for religious origins. In its most sort of cartoonish form, it's the idea that actually what Jesus and the disciples had was a mushroom. And that the reason that there was this profound prophetic experience is that they had access to some kind of mushroom. Or that the soma described in the Vedas, which is obviously some kind of concoction, some kind of plant, and we can speculate well or less well about what that material was really the root, and in some sense, the ultimate, and for some people, only explanation for religious or spiritual experience. So that basically behind the beginnings of the world religions, there's a drug. Now, it's a very interesting thing from this perspective of the flip-flop, because on the one hand, psychedelic proponents, and it's usually proponents who are offering this history, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, even believe to many degrees. And I'm not really saying that I believe or don't believe it, I'm really talking about the way that it functions. And one of the ways that it functions is to simultaneously exalt psychedelic experience as a possible site of the sacred, as a real site of the sacred. And at the same time, it materializes religion. It says, no, it's not about God. It's not about some inherent spirituality insight. It's not about some prophetic experience where the spirits of the angels come down and whisper in ears. No. It's about a substance that we know about that's material, that has material effects. And so you find yourself in this zone, in this interesting kind of flip-flop, where psychedelics simultaneously exalt and affirm something like mystical experience, but at the same time, they withdraw it from a supernaturalist world where it's purely a matter of spirit, that there's some kind of intervention through a material trace. And so even for the proponents, they might not be thinking about it this way. It often functions that way. And even when you see, Clark Heinrich's work, where he draws together all of these remarkable images from medieval art that have these strange, curious mushrooms shapes, lurking in them, and perhaps it's all a conspiracy, that behind all of this stuff there's this secret cult of the mushroom. It's very attractive. It's a very religious idea in a lot of ways. And yet, at the core of it is a materialist explanation. So let's talk about the modern world and the development of psychedelic culture in modernity from the post-war, which is really the place you're going to start talking about it culturally. Of course, there's people who are researchers interested in psychedelics before then, and they are interested in it partly as a way to explain sacred experience and anthropological experience. But it's really in the post-war that we see it become a modern culture. If you look at Aldous Huxley as a sort of a significant figure in sort of the announcement of a kind of new way of integrating psychedelics into modern culture. And it's really fascinating to look at the ways that different phases of psychedelic culture from the 1950s forward have become more or less religious, more or less explicitly spiritual in their aspirations or in their phenomenology. Interestingly, if you look at a lot of accounts from the 1950s, when the form of psychedelics, i.e. the form of taking them, the set and setting, was not particularly or aggressively religious, that the content of a lot of experiences, particularly LSD experiences, is full, overspilling with religious imagery. That's itself already kind of interesting. And then in the 1960s, of course, psychedelics become part of, and in many ways stimulate, the countercultural desire to find and recover ways of being and knowing that are outside of the framework of modernity, outside the framework of materialism, of science, of all of these secular explanations. And so it begins to fire up all of these different practices, interest in Buddhism, interested in Tantra, interest in a variety of practices in the occult, in astrology, and in ethnobotany, and what we would think of as kind of neo-shamanic context. So there's a big upsurge of interest in these things. And yet, the more you look at it, it's hard to say exactly how formally religious a lot of these explorations are. In fact, they almost are defined by a kind of informality that mixes secular and sacred. A Grateful Dead concert is a wonderful example. As a historian or anthropologist of religion, it's very easy to talk about a Grateful Dead concert since circa 1974 as being a kind of psychedelic ritual, as having characteristics that we can see very clearly from religious history as being, in a sense, a kind of ecstatic, shared religion of transcendence and ecstasy. But yet, if you actually go and talk to people and how do they experience and how they say it, they will have widely varying degrees of religious identification with what they're doing, or even spiritual identification with what they're doing. For a lot of people, it was just a great way to get off and have a great time. So there's this tension inside countercultural psychedelic experience between spiritual explanations and interests and very hedonistic, very materialist ways of understanding it, where it's just part of the way you enjoy life, and there's all of that stuff is kind of goofy, which is interesting. Another interesting fact is that when there, in a couple of examples, there are substances that are introduced or that people become interested in that have already with them a kind of religious framework. These are ethnobotanical substances or plants that come, as it were, already packaged with a set of religious assumptions. The great example here is the discovery of the mushroom cult in Oaxaca, Gordon Wasson's famous article. So the introduction of the mushroom into the psychedelic imagination of what we would then call the counterculture comes with it the idea that this is part of, or at least potentially part of, religion. And indeed, many people, hippies went down to Oaxaca to meet Maria Sabina, and she was seen as the seeress and a shaman, and people, began to wanted to have the experience of a traditional shamanic healing ceremony. And yet, if we look at the history then of how mushrooms, different kinds of mushrooms, but psychedelic mushrooms were then consumed over the next 20, 30 years, there's not that much religion that goes into the formal understanding and experience of the material. For individual people, it might have been extraordinarily religious and or spiritual in the way that they dealt with it. But the format, the ritual within which people would take these things was, again, extremely informal in a lot of ways, or ad hoc. Now, and you can say the same thing about peyote as well, that while some people were very interested in the way the Native American church was using peyote, and its highly ritualized, clearly religious, very formal nature, and that some hippies went deep into that, most of the peyote that was used by a lot of counterculture people was kind of diverted from that space. It's a little more complicated situation, but I still think it basically holds. And the reason I'm kind of putting this forward is I want to suggest that something different is happening and has happened with ayahuasca, and it's very, very interesting. So basically what I'm saying is that even when ethnobotanical substances enter into the West with a kind of shamanic or traditional religious framework, in general, those frameworks have been left aside or recreated in a very ad hoc, informal manner. This is not the case with ayahuasca at all. And it's very interesting that as ayahuasca has exploded over the last 15 years, where you can find circles, throughout the West, is that to varying degrees, but still quite predominantly, it has an explicitly religious, or at least formally spiritual framework for it, even to the way that facilitators can function. And while some facilitators have no interest in invoking a shamanic framework, where they're not presenting themselves as people who have been initiated into particular traditional practices, or who use the signs and symbols that suggest a traditional religious practice, like feathers or incense, or whatever kinds of materials suggest to people who are experiencing these ceremonies that there is something traditional and religious going on here. Even for people who avoid that, and there aren't that many of them who have a kind of, let's say, secular approach to it, if you actually look at the formal characteristics of the ceremony, they're holding together a framework, a container, a form that is very ritualistic, very ritualized, and again, from a perspective of a religious studies or anthropology of religion, very recognizable as a form of religious practice. So what I'm saying there is that even as psychedelics in the popular world, in the counterculture, and then increasingly just into sort of, our more nebulous sense of subculture today, or sets of subcultures today. And even as that spread has in many ways involved pulling the sacred or religious potentials of psychedelics out of that context and just having them weave into culture generally, that at the same time there's this strong sense within the underground that a religious framework or a ritualistic framework is most appropriate, at least for this particular substance. And I think that's it's a very interesting and very suggestive and significant part of the rise in popularity and attraction to ayahuasca is precisely its religious format. So again, we're seeing that same kind of mobius strip. So now I want to talk a little bit more about research. So all what I've said, I hope will put a different framework around some of the issues in research. By that, I mean scientific research, the same arc of intention that Neil was talking about, whereas we do more and more studies, we see positive effects from psychedelics in a variety of situations, leading to pressure on the regulatory agency to reschedule, perhaps creating a sort of professional class of people who are allowed to administer these things, or they're made available in different ways, et cetera, et cetera. You're very familiar with this framework. But I hope that what I've been saying has suggested some issues, and in some ways some problems with that framework vis-a-vis the fact that for many people still, psychedelics are a vehicle into the sacred. They are a way, for many people, the way into something like spirituality, i.e., that space that in our culture is precisely defined against the secular world, against the world of scientific research, against the world of products, of professionals who administer. So it's a very interesting situation. Can the research world absorb those deeper spiritual needs, or are we still at a schizophrenic part of our culture where we need things to be outside of that framework in order to allow the sense of a genuinely sacred or spiritual experience? I don't know. But I think the framework that I'm raising here lets us understand some of the dimensions that go on in research in a different way. And I want to talk about a couple examples. One is to start off talking about this wonderful Roland Griffith study from 2006 or 2005, which everybody, I'm sure all you are familiar with, where you showed that, yes, indeed, for people who are not experienced users of psilocybe mushrooms, that they can create something that is, or at least is very like, a primary religious experience, and one that seems to have transformative effects for them over the short term and even over the long term. Now, there's a couple of different ways to go with this study, which is, on one level, wonderful from the research perspective, from the people, from that narrative of change in the way that psychedelics function in our society. There could be nothing better. Here's an excellently designed study that shows that to the degree to which we believe primary religious experience is something, which for many secular people it's not, but for people who are going to acknowledge that that's a reasonable category of reality, then there's clearly this statistical connection. And in addition, it might even have positive effects over the long term, which was an important part of the study. But I just want to suggest that even when you start to think about positive effects over the long term, you're already into that secular, psychopharmaceutical, in some ways materialist way of thinking about. These things are valuable because they have explicitly positive, efficient effects that can solve problems. Okay, that's true. It's wonderful. That's part of the transformative force. But you're already on that mobius strip line when you start to acknowledge that. Now, there's another way of thinking about the Griffith study, and I'm just going to say it as bluntly as possible, which is that on the one hand, if you're invested in this research model, wonderful news, great, it was in the papers, great. But my first reaction when I saw it, just my personal individual reaction, was like, no shit, Sherlock. Like, we all knew that. Everybody knows that. anybody who looks, even people who have not had the experience, who looks at the history of the counterculture, who looks at, ethnobotany or whatever, yeah, we know that. So what exactly is the status of that knowledge? What is the relationship between the we who already know that psychedelics are directly related to the potential for primary spiritual experience and this research fact, this new form of knowledge that enters into a system that is fundamentally secular, fundamentally materialist in its raison d'etre, in its performativity, in the ways in which it reproduces itself in the world. So the fact of that tension, I think, points us to some ways in which if we are invested in the full potential, the full transformative potential of the psychedelic experience, we have to acknowledge that the research model alone doesn't necessarily fit the bill, or rather that it's not sufficient. There's something else that's going on here, and there's some other way of understanding and the very real situation of how psychedelics function outside of conventional culture, outside the law, and their potential spiritual effects. In the most extreme, and I'm overstating my case, is that if psychedelics were legalized tomorrow, across the board, no longer any schedule, they're available, that they might actually lose some of the very effect that allows them to function as spiritually transformative agents in people's lives. I don't know that, but I'm just saying that part of their effect is that they exist outside of that framework. And because secular society is still so incredibly secular, that it's inevitable that they become part of the very machine that people who are seeking spiritual experience, reconnection to nature, a sense of self that's not based on the personality that's part of our mundane world, are looking for. It's just a suggestion. I'm open. I want to ask some questions. Which is not to say that I don't think that the scientific approach is valuable. In fact, the part of it that I think is incredibly valuable and also incredibly useful for anyone who's really invested in the psychedelic experience as a vehicle of spirituality is the questions it makes us ask about the brain and about neurology and about how it is that these phenomena occur. I'm sure some of you know, there's over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a rise in what people call neurotheology. That is, people who are trying to account for the most sublime, transformative, out-of-hand, prophetic, visionary states of consciousness in terms of the brain. Now, there's a way to remember something important to think about this. If you are a materialist, and you want to say that everything that we can talk about can be accounted for in the brain, then you have an interesting problem, which is that you have to go into account for everything. And that means you have to account for déjà vu, clairvoyance, intense psychedelic experience, states of one, all of the sort of plethora of altered states which have for millennia been a source of spiritual meaning for so many people. That means you can't say they're just, that's not important, because they clearly happen. They clearly happen over and over and over and over and over again. But that creates this very interesting thing, because to take that stuff seriously, in some sense, you have to take it. To take DMT seriously, at some point, you have to take it. And if you believe that the sacred adheres, let's say, to the DMT flash, that the mysterium tremendum is unavoidably present in that extreme experience, that there's no way that your reality structure cannot be challenged, shattered, undermined, opened up by that pure experience, then on some way or another, neurology is on a collision course with the full power of the DMT experience. Now, what happens when that really gets deep? What happens when you really get in there? Really interesting stuff, really interesting research. So I'm not talking about research now that's the the scale of how psychedelics can be healing for people, how they can help people with nicotine addiction or with PTSD. That's another level that is, very important. It's wonderful, but it also has those problems that I've been talking about, that it integrates psychedelics into the psychopharmacological model and into the realm of experts and the realm of profit motive, and et cetera, that those things are inevitable, a price worth paying. But that's different than what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is more philosophical, metaphysical, and scientific. It really has to do with how do you account for the psychedelic experience with the minutia of neurology. And that's a fascinating thing, because I think the feeling for many people here, and it's my feeling too, is that the full unleashed power of the psychedelic inevitably undermines your comfortable framework of reality. Inevitably, at some point or another, forces an encounter which is so overwhelming, so full of magic, so full of potential, that the quest to explain that in neurological terms, in scientific terms, in naturalistic terms, pushes those explanations to their farthest point, to a point at which something else might happen. Something else might occur. So rather than saying, no, they're sacred over there, we can't explain it, it's the spirit of the plant, it's the spirit of nature. Those are all excellent frameworks to approach these things. But from a scientific point of view, it's like, no, let's get in there. Let's try to figure out, let's try to account for that in terms of how the brain works. And that process, again, will intensify that mobius strip. Because for every sacred dimension of the experience, there's probably some kind of neural correlate that forces the neural understanding, the neurological explanation farther into the mysterium tremendum, farther into the magnificent, awesome, overwhelming bizarreness of the psychedelic experience. And then once again. And I want to say that process, that dialectical transformative process, is itself psychedelic. But that's part of what the psychedelics do. They don't just provide wonder and magic. They also show you how wonder and magic is produced. They also deconstruct their own creations, and that's part of their lesson, is to drive this process further and farther. I think I'll just end with an example, and I can't talk about it too much because my familiarity is not as great as I would like, but I was very impressed with a work by James Kent, who some of you know, called Psychedelic Information Theory. And what he tries to do, and it's important to note that James Kent is not a scientist. He does not have a PhD. He does not have a research lab. And the reason is that the kind of questions he's interested in asking, you can't ask at this point inside of the research frame. Many of the people who are doing research on psychedelics and other researchers would love to be able to dive much further into some of these phenomenological and ultimately philosophical questions, but the nature of the beast is such that there's certain kinds of questions they can ask and certain kinds of questions that they can't. So James Kent, smart guy, polymath, he can read widely, and he spent a lot of time trying to come up with a model that he talks about as sort of shamanism for the 21st century. He's very brain-based in his approach while respecting the full majesty and wonder and transformative dimensions of the psychedelic experience. And basically what he tries to do is to understand how psychedelics work in terms of signal processing, in terms of information theory, in terms of feedback loops, looking at the brain not so much as a computer, but as a kind of media. For example, he talks about in our conventional frame of mind, we experience reality as, where you can imagine it like we're watching a film, where there's this sort of frame rate of images that come in, and they're constantly being forgotten. Like, the impression I had of the hall 5 seconds ago is gone. Exactly the way you were moving your hand and you were shuffling over there, it's just gone, keeps going away. So that I can maintain a very strong focus on the moment of perception that's carrying me forward. So it's like, it's all coherent. And he talks about the way, and you can show this really clearly with images, that one of the things that happens with the onset of psychedelic state is that the frame rate begins to change and you actually maintain some of those vanishing patterns. This is why you get trails, right? Because you're actually retaining a trace of those frames as they disappear. And so taking these kinds of ideas, talking about particularly how they affect a lot of psychedelic images, he's able to explain a lot of interesting things, like why do psychedelic images look like fractals? Why do mandalas look like the way they do? Why are those things appealing to look at? Why does the artwork and even the music that come out of, let's say, psytrance, a heavily psychedelic music and cultural scene that's designed to intensify and amplify psychedelic experience, why does it have the formal characteristics it does? Because in some ways, psychedelic experience is a kind of information system. It's a kind of media. It's a way of organizing perception and pattern and flow upon which far more marvelous and more difficult to describe things happen. I'm not saying he's like exhausted the explanation or explained how, entity phenomena happen or how higher order hallucinations emerge. But what I'm suggesting is that closer and closer we can get there. Not with a final explanation. I don't believe in final explanations. But that there is something that's being unleashed here about how our brains work, about how we construct reality. And the psychedelics are not just giving us a window into a magical, mystical, sacred world that our natural, secular, materialist world has forgotten. That's a common story you hear. But something more subtle and in some ways more profound and certainly more psychedelic, I think, is happening, which is that in many, many ways, the psychedelics are entering that world, and they're changing it. They're changing the terms with which we understand, experience, and produce, in many ways, these kinds of states. Taking that mobius strip and making it finer and finer and more intense. So while I am very enthusiastic about the current course and the return of psychedelic research, I very much hope that when the opportunity avails itself, that researchers are able not just to find ways that psychedelics can be plugged into a pharmaceutical, psychological model of help, but that they are also used as thinking tools, as ways of modeling and truly understanding the brain, the nature of spiritual experience, and the ways in which we mediate the marvelous. So I think I'll end there. Thank you very much for your attention.